There's a persistent, deeply frustrating crisis that's taking place in the modern Hollywood and the broader Western media landscape. This really deep obsession with retelling existing stories. And I'm not just talking about remaking of old classics just to get a bit of profit out of stories people already love. I am talking about this highly specific trend of taking existing stories and retelling them through a modern perspective, a modern lens. Like, why are we so obsessed with trying to take stories written in like the pre-industrial, pre-modern, pre-democratic era, the eras, and then violently refracting them through this contemporary 21st century lens? Today, we are going to sort of unpack this mechanical and cultural cost of this trend. We will analyze why a lot of these retellings, why a lot of these contemporary retellings actually fail to impress the audience, modern audience. How damaging is it to the integrity of the text when this historical narrative is sort of stripped of its contextual gravity, and also evaluate when and how a modern lens should be used on a story, successfully. Let's dissect Hollywood's modern retelling problem. So, to understand this crisis, we have to first sort of establish what does it mean to like retell a story. Retelling a story doesn't literally mean retelling it point by point as it is. You're taking each sentence, each line, each character dialogue, taking it and just retelling, like that would technically be plagiarism. True retelling is this profound active engagement with the underlying themes of the text, the character architecture, structure, plot, all of it. You engage with what the story is trying to say, what the story is, and what the characters inside it are. It retains the original spiritual core while intentionally altering, let's say, the perspective, messaging, or the setting to generate this really fresh, unique revelation, this really fresh, unique story. For instance, if I had to say, let's say, retell the story of Cinderella, I would have two paths to do that, two ways to do that. One way would be for me to preserve the exact historical setting, the historical era, the original setting of the original fairy tale. However, what I will change would be the way the story that I'm trying to tell, the retelling I'm going to do, is how it's going to sort of interrogate and engage with the themes of class, abuse, and survival that are prominent within the original story. Path B, the other path that I would take, would be to take the core themes that exist in the story, the core ideas, the core plot, but change the setting. Like, put Cinderella in this really modern world, like she just wakes up in this modern city with phones and whatever. But modern Hollywood studios routinely fail to sort of distinguish between the two. They don't really seem to understand that remaking and retailing are two different things. Whenever a studio announces like they will be remaking an old classic, there's always this line that exists with it, that comes along with it, and that's like, we're going to change the original story to fit the modern times, to make it fit for the modern audience. And that, by definition, would mean that you're not technically remaking, you are retelling. You're attempting to retell a story by changing something within it, changing your interpretation of what it is. Retelling a story is a high-wire creative act. It requires creativity to retell a story. It requires immense narrative sort of precision to sort of sit with this old text, interact with its theme, its characters, its plot, understand it, and understand what needs to be changed, how that things needs to be changed, instead of simply just plagiarizing an existing IP with while adding like zero artistic value of your own. Today, Hollywood is utterly paralyzed in this dead zone between these two concepts of retelling and remaking. They are terrified of a pure remake because the original historical sort of source material, the original historical movie or text, whatever the inspiration is driven from, might harbor, let's say, outdated socio-political themes that would ignite immediate backlash if presented to the current modern audience. On the other hand, they're also really ham-fisted on their attempts to sort of fix the story through a modern lens, make it more modern, and that completely shatters the narrative's internal logic, giving us this compromised product that is worse in structure compared to the original, shallower in characters, and flat in messaging. So, where does the execution technically fall apart? To diagnose this failure of modern studio systems, we will have to look at instances where it failed and instances where it actually succeeded, rare instances where it succeeded. Let me be clear, art is very subjective, so what I might like, you might not like. So the case studies, like the movies that I'm going to be discussing today, I'm going to discuss them from a perspective of me as a writer, what I think accounts for good writing. And so you're completely allowed to disagree with the examples that I'm going to take. When looking at the massive wave of recent live action Disney adaptations, there are two distinct movies that, in my perspective, are somewhat of a good remake, good retelling of the original story or whatever. Cruella and Maleficent. Now, Cruella isn't technically a retelling of the original 101 Dalmatians. It instead just takes up a character from that movie and gives them like a backstory of its own. But I think it does it exists with this masterclass of parallel narrative independence. Like, you can look at Cruella as a standalone piece of cinema without constantly comparing it to 101 Dalmatians, particularly the way Cruella was represented in that movie. You don't necessarily have to do that. You can consider it as sort of Cruella in a different parallel world. What if Cruella, what if this is what led Cruella to be? And I think it adds a bit of nuance to like a straight up evil villain. And for that reason, what it does is that it quickly establishes its own gravity, its own stakes, and more importantly, its own aesthetic. Like, it distinguishes itself from the original without having the legacy of the original compromise its own structural integrity, also while not allowing its own existence to sort of destroy the original movie. Our second example is Maleficent, which is directly a retelling of Sleeping Beauty, not Aurora. Princess Aurora is the main character, the Sleeping Beauty story. This film introduces massive radical shifts to the established fairy tale canon. Yet, the internal mechanics work flawlessly. Why, you may ask? Because it anchors its subversion in two precise creative choices, okay? POV transformation and thematic reinterpretation. The script doesn't lazily rewrite Princess Aurora to fit like a modern archetype. No, they don't turn her into some sort of modern girl boss or like feminist girl boss or whatever people don't like these days. Instead, it leaves her intact and completely retains her core traits. Instead, what it does is takes the camera off of her and puts it onto Maleficent's perspective, changing that point of view instantly breathes fresh, unique life into a familiar story. It allows the readers and the writers to actually radically re examine the classical definition of true love, transforming it from like a passive trope into this really profound maternal emotional climax. By retaining the core innocence of the original protagonist, aka Princess Aurora, while changing the perspective and re engineering the central theme, Maleficent demands to be appreciated on its own unique creative terms. It proves that you can actually dismantle a classical story without destroying its soul. Now that we have looked at the good examples, let us look at some of the most structurally compromised retellings and remakes of our recent times, movies that people hated. Snow White and Mulan. Snow White, that was recently released, the live action adaptation, and of course the 2020 adaptation of Mulan. The foundational error with Snow White, let's start with Snow White, is that it takes the original plot, it keeps it intact, roughly intact. It only changes the characters within that plot, completely reframing their character traits to fit a modern understanding of those characters. In the plot of the original Snow White functioned seamlessly because the protagonist was a certain kind of character, a highly specific nurturing character archetype. Consider the particular sequence where the dwarves first meet Snow White. Snow White enters their hut. She finds it unclean. She, with the help of magical animals, cleans the hut and then goes to sleep. And then the dwarves come back home. They see the house clean. They see her. They meet her, and they find out who she is. They she she doesn't win over them by threatening them or anything. She wins them over with her organic kindness. They are really impressed by her genuine empathy, and that eventually logically establishes their unshakable loyalty to her later in the film. However, this is where the live action adaptation actually fails. Snow White enters the homes of these dwarves and just straight up goes to sleep in a stranger's house. And when the dwarves eventually discover her, they of course are horrified at this stranger in their bed. And of course there's a back and forth, and she tells them she's a princess, that the queen is after her, and that she would die if the queen finds her. And the dwarves just let her stay. They agree. They are like, yeah, like she can stay, without any sort of back and forth as to what will we get if we let you stay. Like, why should we let you stay? They just let her stay. Instead of offering grace, she arrives as this stranger, bosses them around, and demands they clean up. Like, imagine a stranger, absolute stranger, walking into your private house, not only demanding to stay there, but also just, actually immediately dictating how you should be living your life. The entire narrative engine collapses at that moment. The dwarf's subsequent willingness to risk their lives to protect her, to be by her side, makes absolute zero sense. And compare and contrast this with the 1937 masterpiece. The entire reason the dwarves let Snow White, stay is, of course, as I said, genuine kindness, but also because she explicitly offers them something in return for their house, for staying in their house. She volunteers to manage the household, and in exchange, the dwarves are like, okay, we will let you stay in this house for your sake of, protection and whatever. To borrow a classic line from the C-drama character, it was a dynamic of equivalent exchange. I give you this, you give me that, we're done. But by systemically sort of stripping this mutual transaction, because a live adaptation movie takes that cleaning scene and puts it after they have discovered Snow White, the dwarf's immediate compliance in that movie then starts to feel completely illogical. And more importantly, the grumpy, the one of the dwarfs, his fierce and vocal protests against letting an entitled stranger stay in their home starts to feel entirely justified. Like, you start to be like, yes, he's right. Like, why are we letting this random stranger stay at our house and just hold on our materials or whatever? This highlights a fundamental law of creative writing. Plot gives birth to character, and character gives birth to plot. They exist in the state of absolute correlation. You cannot change one without changing the other. You'll have to change them simultaneously so they continue to fit along. Because once you change, let's say, the character, suddenly the character will be in a plot that is meant for a different kind of character, and the mismatch is really going to lead to a bad story. If you want to, let's say, write a sharp, intelligent, confident girl boss Snow White, then you will have to re-engineer the setting and the conflict to match her agency. For example, you could have Snow White be this warrior princess where her father has taught her how to fight, how to wield a sword, and then this queen comes along and she has bigger plans, and she sends somebody after Snow White not for like the fairness, but because she thinks because she's a warrior princess, then she is a threat to her throne or whatever. Like, that would make sense. Like, that would make entire sense. Now, let's say let's say you would take this original, naive, very gentle, very kind, very soft Snow White from the original 1937 movie. You know, you completely do not change her character, you keep her intact and drop her into this really hyper violent, modern gangster underworld. She's going to feel entirely absurd and out of place in that story. Similarly, if you take a completely different kind of Snow White and put her into a story that is meant for like a different kind of Snow White, you get the Snow White live action adaptation. Our second failure of narrative translation is the 2020 live action Mulan. I hated this movie. I had to actually write a paper on it. Had to not, I chose to write it for one of my courses, where I, compared this movie with the 1998 original classic, the source material, which is Ballad of Mulan, and of course a Chinese adaptation of Mulan that was released in the same year. I compared it with these three movies through the lens of Orientalism. And let me tell you, this movie failed on every single metric of comparative storytelling. It simultaneously failed to honor both the original classic and the source material, the Ballad of Mulan. Like, it didn't do justice to either of them. The spiritual core of Mulan, if you do not know, let me tell you, has always been a profound emotional exploration of filial piety. A daughter's deep love for her family that drives her to sacrifice her own safety and go to war because her injured father or old father, whatever, is not able to, cannot to, and she wants to protect him, so she offers herself up by disguising as a male. The modern film, on the other hand, the 2020 live action adaptation, it completely throws out this emotional anchor out of the window. It injects artificial concepts that are fundamentally alien to the historical Chinese philosophy. It while doing my research for this movie, I came across a review for this movie, and the YouTuber reviewing it pointed out how this movie misrepresents and misinterprets and represents the idea of chi. In the movie, at the very start, Mulan's father is telling her like chi, girls don't possess chi, only warriors can possess chi. And Yoruba was like, chi in Chinese philosophy, if you do not know, it's a life force that it's inherent to all living beings, all living beings, if you are in watch a person who actually watches wuxia shanxia dramas like me, you would know that in those dramas chi is something that is just thrown around, like every character has chi, like she damaged her chi or he damaged her chi or whatever. But the point is that chi is something that every single person possesses. It's, as the YouTuber put it, it's like blood. And saying that a male warrior can possess chi but a female can't, it's like saying a male person can possess blood but a female person like can't possess, like that makes absolutely no sense. This put this in addition to the fact that the film discusses the themes of filial duty, and then also introduces Western themes, Western understandings, and Western archetypes into the film, particularly the idea of a witch. Like, it isn't in the Ballad of Mulan, it isn't in the 1998 classic, it the entire idea of which is not even in traditional Chinese folklore. Like, a bit of research will tell you, as I did for my paper, that the idea of witch, there is no word for witch, there is no literal translation for witch in Chinese folklore, because nothing like that exists. That idea doesn't exist in Chinese understanding at all, and as I said, nor does it appear in the Ballad of Mulan. The resulting retelling is this really hollow, disorganized mismatch of Western high fantasy tropes and Western individualistic traits. This structural framework would work if you had like Mulan in medieval Europe or something like that. But this is ancient China. These people are people in ancient China. Their understanding of a lot of things is going to be based on the society of ancient China. They can't possibly be thinking through a modern Americanized version. So forcing an Americanized superheroic lens onto this non-Western historical epic completely strips it of its soul. Conversely, the Chinese adaptation of Mulan that was released in the same year, on the other hand, that was, that had emotional depth. It was deeply moving, it was profound and deeply human. Like, I cried during the last few minutes of the movie. That's how it's hit me. The scenes hit me, like it was very painful to watch. So in case you want to check this movie out, and I suggest you do because it's really great, then I'll likely share a link in the description. Also, if you want to see a brilliant example of how to take stories, sort of idea, or sort of roughly the plot, not exactly the plot, but roughly a plot, then you should definitely try out watching Arsenal Military Academy. It's a brilliant Chinese drama, and while it's not officially like a retelling of Mulan, the plot somewhat feels inspired from it, given the fact the main character is a girl who disguises herself as a male to enter a military academy. And in addition to that, its narrative framework is transposed onto this complex politics of Republican era China, particularly around like the World War I and the Japan-China conflict. It respects the cultural gravity of the disguised trope while executing brilliant character stakes. So this tells us one thing: we should stop Americanizing non-Western historical epics. This brings us finally to the overarching systemic question: why does the modern media space remain so fiercely insistent on trying to, retell historical narratives through a modern lens, despite the fact that the many of their attempts have led to failure. We must realize that cultural ideologies are ever changing. Like ideas that existed like a century ago do not exist today or are actively criticized and critiqued in today's days. Similarly, ideas that exist today might very likely not exist a century from now onwards. And if this trend of taking an old story and retelling it in this modern perspective, if this cycle continues, then we will have a generation 100 years from now that's going to take stories written in today's world and violently warp them to fit whatever ideological lens dominates their timeline. While the act of adaptation in and of itself is a completely valid artistic pursuit, we have to confront a harsh reality. Modern retelling, particularly the kind that's happening in these times, almost always involves an aggressive distortion of the text's original intent. In their haste to sort of commodify legacy intellectual properties, contemporary storytellers and script writers consistently fail to account for historical context. They ignore when the story was written, written, why it was written, and more importantly, what is that specific truth that it was trying to communicate to its original audience, the audience of the time that it was written in. True narrative adaptation requires an entirely different methodology. It's not just changing a few things. A successful modern retelling demands that you look at the contemporary world, ask yourself a rigorous structural question about why this specific plot mechanics needs to be revived today. Like, why I'm going to choose this particular story to be retold for the current times. And most importantly, you need to identify the thematic equivalent of the original message that the modern audience actually needs to hear. By utilizing this sort of framework, you leave the authenticity of the original text completely unharmed and violated. You treat it with respect, drawing inspiration from its structural template to build an entirely new architectural narrative architecture that naturally fits the parameters of the modern world. To do otherwise, that is to force this ancient or pre-modern text to sort of yield to 21st century ideals, 21st century understanding of things, by arbitrarily twisting its plot points, that is straight up revisionist disrespect to the author's original vision. It results in this incredibly lazy form of literary analysis where a creator starts to read in between the lines of a old text, like an 18th century text, and be like, this specific scene is this intentional critique of modern intersectional feminism or whatever. In reality, that conceptual framework, this idea of feminism, intersectionality, or all of it probably didn't exist within the writer's universe, within the timeline the writer is writing in, making it functionally and fundamentally impossible to be the driving force of the text, to even exist in the subtleness of the text's lines. These ideologically forced retellings don't just hand us this structurally broken cinema, they actively dilute our collective cultural literacy. Our modern obsession with this practice actually stems from a toxic paradox. Like, we want old stories, we love old stories, we love the nostalgia that they bring. However, we also cannot overcome this inability to consume anything that doesn't perfectly mirror our immediate contemporary reflection. And when these two conflicting sort of parameters collide, we get a very compromised, poorly written script that neither honors the gravity of the original text nor feels authentic to the current audience. It just is hanging somewhere in the middle. It is entirely acceptable if a historical story doesn't conform to like modern standards. It doesn't fit modern standards. Like that is what it's supposed to be. It was written at a time when these modern standards didn't exist. If an old story sort of doesn't fit the contemporary worldview, the solution is actually beautifully simple. Stop rewriting and start inventing. Write original stories, build new worlds, craft your own myths. Tell me, when was the last time we got a good fantasy with deeply profound messaging about friendship and struggle and all of that, like Lord of the Rings? Like, we lack that kind of storytelling in these days because we're so obsessed on what has already been told instead of telling something new. And if we do not do anything about it, 100 years from now, history is going to look back at our generation and wonder why we were so utterly terrified of our own imagination and why we were so oddly obsessed with retelling historical texts. So, when is it actually appropriate to tell a modern story? Well, the answer is, I think, simple. One, you need to understand why the story needs to be told. Like, what part of the story that you're trying to retell is going to have an impact on the current modern world? If not, it's probably left, aside and untouched. And doing something like a retelling, doing that successfully means that change certain things inside that story. Maybe take the problems and struggles that were depicted in that story, take them out and replace them with the struggles and problems of the current world. And of course, as I said, find a thematic equivalent of the story's original message. Also, because it's a creative act and it's an artistic choice, all of it eventually entirely resides on you, on when you want to or how you want to retell a story. You possess the freedom to draw whatever you want and whenever you want. But what you need to keep in mind is, if you choose to enter this arena of adaptation and choose to retell stories, then you must remain acutely aware of why stories are retold and how they must be engineered to honor the craft. And with that final note, we close the gates to the courtyard today. If you enjoyed this structural breakdown of the modern retelling problem in social media, not social media, Hollywood, please take a moment to explore like the rest of the courtyard and check out my other videos. Drop a comment with your thoughts on what we have discussed today. Also, if you're not subscribed, please hit that subscribe button for more such videos. On a second thought, though, like a Mulan retelling meticulously sit within the socio-political landscape of medieval Europe sounds incredibly fascinating. Well, regardless, thank you for, being with me in the courtyard today. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, keep theorizing.